The autumn evening was drawing to a close as a silver Honda Civic smoothly navigated through the peaceful suburban streets of Cedar Grove. Behind the wheel sat a 17-year-old high school senior, her dark curly hair neatly pulled back in a ponytail, AP biology textbook visible on the passenger seat beside her. She had just finished another productive study session at the local library with her advanced placement group. Their finals were approaching, and as the daughter of a federal agent, she took her academics seriously. Her dad always said education was the key to breaking through any barrier, and she lived by those words. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the familiar roads she'd driven countless times before. The clock on her dashboard read 7:45 p.m., still well before her 9 p.m. curfew. She hummed along to a soft indie song playing through her car speakers, thinking about the biology test coming up next week. As she approached the intersection at Maple and Oak, the traffic light turned yellow. Following her father's careful driving lessons, she eased to a complete stop, even though she probably could have made it through. Better safe than sorry, that was another one of Dad's favorite sayings. The red light gleamed against her windshield as she waited patiently, fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel to the rhythm of her music. In her rearview mirror, she noticed a police cruiser pulling up behind her. She didn't think much of it at first. This was a safe neighborhood, and her father's FBI credentials were clearly displayed in the small holder on her windshield, just as he had advised. When the light turned green, she proceeded carefully through the intersection, maintaining the exact speed limit. The police cruiser followed. 2 blocks later, red and blue lights suddenly erupted in her mirror, accompanied by a short burst of siren. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. Again, she followed her father's instructions perfectly. Turn on the interior light, pull over safely, keep hands visible on the steering wheel. She guided her car to the curb, making sure to signal properly. Through her mirror, she watched as Officer R. Brooks stepped out of his patrol car. Even from a distance, she could tell something was off about his approach. Most officers moved with professional caution, but this one's walk seemed aggressive, almost eager. His hand was already resting on his weapon, a detail that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. A small group of people had gathered at the corner coffee shop, their evening conversations pausing as they watched the scene unfold. Mrs. Chen, who owned the local grocery store, stood in her doorway with a concerned expression. Several passers-by slowed their pace, some discreetly pulling out their phones. The young student took a deep breath, reminding herself that she hadn't done anything wrong. She was an honor roll student, president of the debate club, and had never even had a parking ticket. Whatever this was about, she could handle it calmly and respectfully, just as her parents had taught her. But as Officer Brooks reached her window, the look in his eyes told her this traffic stop was about something else entirely. His face was set in a hard scowl, and his next words would set in motion a chain of events that would shake their entire community to its core. Little did Officer Brooks know, his actions that evening would not only reveal deep-rooted problems within the local police department, but would also lead to one of the most significant cases of police reform in the state's history. The truth about his past behavior was about to come to light, and the consequences would leave everyone in Cedar Grove speechless. The sudden flash of the officer's flashlight in her eyes marked the beginning of an incident that would transform not just her life, but the lives of countless others who had suffered in silence. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like a routine traffic stop on an ordinary autumn evening. The beam from Officer Brooks' flashlight swept across the car's interior, lingering unnecessarily long on the young driver's face. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp enough to make nearby onlookers flinch. The student reached slowly for her glove compartment, narrating her movements just as her father had taught her. "Sir, I'm going to reach for my documents now," she said clearly, keeping one hand visible on the steering wheel. The officer's response was immediate and hostile. "Did I ask you to speak? Just get the documents." His voice carried across the quiet street, drawing more attention from passers-by. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store had now stepped fully onto the sidewalk, her phone discreetly recording the interaction. 2 college students at the coffee shop also had their phones out, their faces showing growing concern at the officer's aggressive behavior. "Sir," the young driver tried again, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "may I ask why I was pulled over?" She handed her documents through the window, making sure to include her father's FBI family credential holder, which clearly displayed his badge number and department. Officer Brooks snatched the documents roughly, deliberately dropping the FBI credential holder on the ground. "You ran that red light back there," he stated, his voice dripping with condescension. "Don't try to deny it." "Officer, I'm certain I made a complete stop." "There are witnesses who can confirm," she began, but Brooks cut her off with a sharp rap on her car roof. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." The growing crowd of onlookers shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Patel, the pharmacist who was just closing his shop, joined Mrs. Chen on the sidewalk. "She's right, you know," he called out. "I watched her stop at that light. I see her drive past my store every day after her study group. She's a good kid." Officer Brooks ignored the comment completely. "I said, step out of the vehicle." His hand moved to his weapon again, causing several gasps from the gathered crowd. The student, fighting to remain calm, carefully opened her door and stepped out, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," Brooks commanded, despite the fact that she was clearly cooperating. When she complied, he roughly grabbed her wrist, twisting it painfully as he spun her around. The young woman couldn't help but let out a small cry of pain. "Stop resisting," Brooks shouted, though she clearly wasn't. Mrs. Chen's voice rang out from the sidewalk. "She's not resisting at all. This isn't right." Several other voices joined in protest, but Brooks seemed energized by the audience, pushing the student harder against the car. "You think your daddy's FBI badge means you can disrespect an officer?" he growled, quiet enough that only she could hear. "Well, sweetheart, this is my town. Your daddy's badge doesn't mean anything here." In a fluid motion that spoke of practiced aggression, Brooks yanked both of her arms behind her back and slapped on his handcuffs, tightening them far more than necessary. The metal bit into her skin, but she bit her lip, refusing to give him the satisfaction of hearing her pain. "You're under arrest for running a red light, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct," Brooks announced loudly, yanking her toward his patrol car. The crowd had grown larger now, with dozens of phones recording the incident. Someone in the crowd shouted that they were calling the police station to report Brooks, while others noted down his badge number. As she was roughly pushed into the back of the patrol car, the student caught a glimpse of Mrs. Chen's determined face as the shop owner spoke rapidly into her phone. Mr. Patel was writing something in his notepad, likely documenting everything he'd witnessed. The two college students from the coffee shop were uploading their videos to social media, their faces set with righteous anger. What Officer Brooks didn't realize was that his actions weren't just being recorded by the witnesses' phones, they were being broadcast live across multiple social media platforms. By the time they reached the police station, the incident would already be trending locally. By morning, it would explode across national news networks. The young woman sat quietly in the back of the patrol car, her wrists throbbing from the too tight handcuffs. But despite the pain and humiliation, she felt a strange calm. Her father had always told her that justice had a way of finding the truth. As they drove away from the growing crowd of witnesses, she remembered another thing he often said: sometimes the biggest mistakes people make is thinking they're untouchable. Officer Brooks had no idea that his career was about to unravel thread by thread, starting with this single traffic stop. His years of unchecked behavior were about to catch up with him, and the reckoning would be swift and complete. The thin blue line he had hidden behind was about to be redrawn by someone who knew exactly how to wield the power of federal law enforcement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the police station's processing area, casting harsh shadows across the cold metal bench where the young student sat. Her wrists still bore red marks from the overly tight handcuffs, though they'd finally been removed during booking. The clock on the wall read 9:30 p.m. Her curfew had come and gone, and she knew her parents would be worried sick. A tired-looking desk sergeant glanced up from his computer periodically, his expression shifting between concern and discomfort whenever he looked at her. He'd seen the preliminary report, and something about it didn't sit right with him. The charges seemed excessive for a supposed traffic violation, especially given the student's clean record and family background. "You get one phone call," he finally said, his voice softer than regulation typically required. "Make it count." He led her to a worn desk with an outdated landline phone, turning slightly to give her a semblance of privacy while maintaining required supervision. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed her father's number, not from fear, but from the effort of containing her emotions. She was determined to handle this situation with the dignity and strength her parents had instilled in her. The phone rang twice before her father's warm, steady voice answered. "Dad," she said, keeping her voice clear and controlled. "I need your help. I've been arrested." She could hear her father's sharp intake of breath, but his tone remained calm as he asked for details. Years of FBI training had taught him the value of gathering information before reacting. She recounted everything exactly as it happened: the complete stop at the red light, Officer Brooks' aggressive approach, the twisted wrist, the witnesses who tried to speak up for her. She described how the officer had deliberately dropped the FBI credential, his whispered threats, and the unnecessarily tight handcuffs. Throughout her account, she could hear her father taking notes, his pen scratching quietly against paper. "Are you hurt?" her father asked, his voice carrying the weight of both professional concern and parental worry. When she mentioned her wrist, she heard him murmur something to someone else in the room, likely his partner at the bureau, who often worked late with him. The witnesses were recording everything, she added, remembering Mrs. Chen's determined face and Mr. Patel's careful note-taking. And Officer Brooks, she lowered her voice, glancing at the desk sergeant who had busied himself with paperwork. "He made it clear this was about you being FBI. He said this was his town and that your badge meant nothing here." Her father's silence spoke volumes. She could almost see him in his office, his jaw set in that way it did when he encountered injustice in his line of work. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of steel that she recognized from the rare times she'd seen him truly angry. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Don't sign anything. Don't answer any questions beyond basic information. I'm already putting things in motion, but I need you to stay strong for a little while longer. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, sir," she replied, drawing strength from his confidence. "I remember everything you taught me about situations like this." "That's my girl," he said warmly. "Your mom and I will be there soon, but not alone. Just sit tight and remember, you've done nothing wrong. The truth is going to come out, and Officer Brooks is about to learn a hard lesson about abuse of power." As she hung up the phone, she caught the desk sergeant quickly averting his eyes, but not before she saw the mix of sympathy and unease on his face. He'd clearly overheard enough to know this case was about to become much bigger than a simple traffic stop. Back in his office, her father had already begun making calls. His first was to the FBI's Civil Rights Division. The second was to an old friend who now headed the Internal Affairs Division of a neighboring police department. The third was to a civil rights attorney who specialized in police misconduct cases. Meanwhile, social media was exploding with videos of the incident. Mrs. Chen's live stream had been shared thousands of times. The college students' videos were trending locally. Local news stations were picking up the story, focusing particularly on the clear discrepancy between the students' calm compliance and Officer Brooks' aggressive behavior. The young woman sat back on the cold bench, her father's words echoing in her mind. She thought about all the others who might have faced similar treatment but lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back. As she waited, she made a silent promise to herself that this incident wouldn't just be about her, it would be about making sure Officer Brooks couldn't do this to anyone else. Little did the officer know, but his actions that night had set in motion a chain of events that would expose years of misconduct and transform an entire police department. The FBI agent's daughter he tried to intimidate would become the catalyst for change that the community had needed for years. Sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways, and tonight it was starting with a single phone call from a police station bench. While his daughter sat in the police station, the FBI agent's office had transformed into a hub of intense activity. Computer screens glowed in the darkness as his team worked with quiet efficiency. Instead of rushing to the station in anger, he knew the best way to help his daughter was to build an ironclad case. "Pull up everything on Officer Brooks," he instructed his partner, who was already typing rapidly at her keyboard. "Every complaint, every incident report, every traffic stop he's made in the last 5 years." Their colleagues from other departments had started arriving, drawn by both professional duty and personal loyalty. A young tech analyst rushed in with a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this. The videos are everywhere." The screen showed multiple angles of his daughter's arrest, captured by concerned citizens. Each view revealed something more disturbing about Brooks' behavior. The tech analyst had already started running the footage through enhancement software to capture every detail. "Look at his body language," noted a behavioral analyst who'd volunteered to help. "The aggressive stance, the immediate hand-on weapon, the unnecessary physical force. This isn't his first time doing this." She was already creating a profile based on Brooks' patterns of behavior. Meanwhile, in another corner of the office, two investigators were poring over police department records they'd obtained through official channels. "There's a pattern here," one muttered, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Look at these traffic stop statistics. The racial disparity is off the charts." The FBI agent's phone buzzed continuously with messages from other law enforcement professionals offering help. A retired judge called to offer her insights. Civil rights attorneys sent over case files of similar incidents they'd handled. Even former police officers reached out, some willing to testify about Brooks' past behavior they'd witnessed but had been afraid to report. "Sir," called out another analyst, "I've got something from social media." She turned her screen to show a series of posts from Brooks' private accounts that had been archived by alert citizens. The content revealed deeply troubling views and connections to questionable groups. This goes way beyond one bad traffic stop. The internal affairs investigator from the neighboring district arrived with boxes of files. "You're not going to believe this," he said, spreading documents across the conference table. "Brooks has worked in 3 different departments in the past 8 years. He's got a history of resigning just before disciplinary actions take effect." Hour by hour, the evidence mounted. Witness statements from the scene were pouring in via email. Mrs. Chen had organized other business owners from the street, and they'd all written detailed accounts of what they'd seen. Mr. Patel provided security camera footage from his pharmacy that showed the student's car clearly stopping at the red light. The civil rights attorney arrived close to midnight, her arms full of similar cases she handled. "This is bigger than Officer Brooks," she explained, laying out a complex web of departmental policies and oversight failures. "The whole system that protected him needs to be exposed." The FBI agent looked at the growing mountain of evidence with grim satisfaction. He'd known racism existed in law enforcement. He'd fought against it his entire career. But seeing it directed at his daughter had ignited a different kind of fire. This wasn't just about one night or one officer anymore. This was about changing the system. His team had uncovered dozens of similar incidents involving Brooks, many of which had been swept under the rug. Young people of color who'd been harassed but were too scared to file formal complaints. Dash cam footage that had mysteriously malfunctioned during contentious stops. Internal complaints from fellow officers that had been buried in bureaucracy. "Look at this," called out the tech analyst. He'd found patterns in Brooks' shift schedules. He deliberately requested patrols in certain neighborhoods at specific times, targeting young minority drivers during hours when supervision was minimal. The behavior was so systematic it couldn't be coincidental. As the night wore on, the investigation expanded beyond Brooks. Who had helped cover up his previous incidents? Why had his personnel file been scrubbed clean when he transferred between departments? How had his social media activity not raised red flags during background checks? The FBI agent checked his watch, almost time to head to the police station. But now he wouldn't be walking in as just an angry father. He'd be arriving with a task force of federal investigators, civil rights attorneys, and enough evidence to shake the department to its foundations. "Send everything to the U.S. Attorney's office," he instructed his team. "Every video, every document, every witness statement. And get me the police chief's boss on the phone, the one who answers to the city council. It's time they learned exactly what kind of officer they've been protecting." As he gathered his coat, his partner handed him one last document, a preliminary timeline of Brooks' career showing a clear pattern of escalating behavior. "This ends tonight," he said quietly, looking at the photo of his daughter on his desk. "Not just for her, but for everyone who couldn't fight back." The team watched him leave, knowing that by morning, the local police department would face a reckoning unlike anything they'd seen before. Sometimes it took one incident, one brave person, to expose years of systemic problems. Tonight, Officer Brooks' badge would become a symbol not of power, but of the change that was long overdue. Dawn was breaking over the city as the investigation team gathered in the main conference room. Coffee cups littered the tables among stacks of documents and laptops, displaying endless streams of data. What had started as a response to one wrongful arrest had uncovered a story that would shock the entire community. The tech analyst's eyes were red from staring at screens all night, but his voice was excited as he presented his findings. "We've recovered every dashcam video from Brooks' patrol car for the past 3 years," he explained, pointing to a wall of screens showing different traffic stops. "The pattern is impossible to ignore." The videos played in sequence, showing stop after stop where Brooks used excessive force, particularly against young minority drivers. In many cases, the official reports didn't match what the videos showed. More disturbing were the gaps, times when the camera mysteriously stopped working during crucial moments. A junior investigator raised her hand. "I've been going through citizen complaints," she said, spreading out a stack of papers. "Most were dismissed without investigation, but look at these stories." She began reading accounts from community members who'd encountered Brooks, stories that had been buried in filing cabinets and ignored. There was the college student who missed an important exam because Brooks held him for 3 hours over a broken taillight. The young mother who was dragged from her car while her children watched, allegedly for having an air freshener hanging from her mirror. The teenager who quit his night job because Brooks would follow him home every evening. The social media evidence is even worse, another analyst called out. She projected screenshots onto the wall. Brooks' private accounts revealed connections to hate groups and racist comments stretching back years. He was careful to keep these accounts separate from his official identity, but he got sloppy. He used the same username pattern across platforms. The civil rights attorney who'd been working through the night looked up from her laptop. "I'd found similar cases in neighboring districts," she announced. 3 departments in 8 years, each time leaving just before formal investigations could begin. Someone was helping him, tipping him off, cleaning his record. The internal affairs investigator added his own disturbing discovery. "Look at these performance reviews," he said, spreading documents across the table. "They're practically identical, year after year. No red flags, no warnings, nothing but praise. It's like they were copied and pasted." A forensic accountant who joined the investigation raised an interesting point. "His lifestyle doesn't match his salary," she noted, showing bank records. "Regular cash deposits just under reporting limits, expensive cars, a boat. Where's this money coming from?" The behavioral analyst had created a timeline of escalation. "His actions have been getting bolder, more aggressive," she explained, pointing to a graph. "The physical confrontations are increasing. He's becoming more confident in his ability to avoid consequences." Just then, the FBI agent's phone buzzed. It was Mrs. Chen, the shop owner who'd witnessed his daughter's arrest. "You need to see this," she said. She'd organized a community meeting overnight, and dozens of people had come forward with their own stories about Brooks. She was sending video testimonies from people who'd been too afraid to file official complaints. The tech team was also making progress on the department's internal communications. Emails showed a pattern of senior officers dismissing complaints about Brooks, sometimes without even reading them. There were jokes about his aggressive style and comments about how he kept certain neighborhoods in line. "Sir," called one of the younger agents, "you should see these training records." The documents showed that Brooks had failed several de-escalation courses but was allowed to remain on patrol. Notes from instructors expressing concern about his temperament had been removed from his official file, but copies remained in the training center's archives. The Civil Rights Division had uncovered another troubling pattern. Brooks consistently targeted areas near colleges and community centers during times when young minority students would be traveling to and from classes or work. His stops in these areas were significantly higher than any other officers and resulted in more arrests for minor infractions. As morning light filled the room, the team gathered around the conference table for a briefing. The evidence was overwhelming. Years of systematic abuse, covered up by a network of enablers within the department. Brooks wasn't just one bad officer, he was a symptom of a deeper problem. "We're not just building a case against Brooks," the FBI agent told his team. "We're exposing everyone who helped him get away with this for so long. The supervisors who ignored complaints, the administrators who cleaned his record, the fellow officers who looked the other way." The civil rights attorney nodded in agreement. "This case could set a precedent," she said. "It's not just about removing one officer. It's about changing how departments handle these situations, how they screen for bias, how they respond to community complaints." As the team prepared their findings for presentation to federal prosecutors, they knew this case would send shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Brooks had thought he was untouchable, protected by his badge and the system that had shielded him for years. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and community members as the FBI agent walked in with his legal team. It had been 3 weeks since his daughter's arrest, and today was the first major hearing in what had become known as the Cedar Grove Police Investigation. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Brooks sat with his union-appointed attorney, his usual confidence noticeably shaken. The police chief and several senior officers occupied the rows behind him, their faces grim as they watched federal prosecutors arrange stacks of evidence on their table. The judge, a respected veteran of the bench known for her fairness, called the court to order. As she reviewed the preliminary evidence, her expression grew increasingly stern. The prosecution's opening statement laid out a devastating timeline of abuse, corruption, and cover-ups that stretched back nearly a decade. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor began, "what happened to this young honor student was not an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a system that protected and enabled Officer Brooks' behavior for years." She gestured to the boxes of evidence that lined the courtroom walls. "We have proof of over 200 similar incidents." The tech team had prepared a powerful multimedia presentation. On the courtroom screens, dashcam videos played in sequence, showing Brooks' escalating pattern of aggressive behavior. The footage from his daughter's arrest was particularly damning when played alongside similar incidents from his past. Mrs. Chen testified about what she'd witnessed that night, her voice steady as she described Brooks' unnecessary aggression. Mr. Patel's pharmacy security footage clearly showed the student's car stopping at the red light, destroying Brooks' justification for the initial stop. The internal affairs investigator's testimony hit like a bombshell. He revealed how complaints against Brooks had been systematically buried, how evidence had disappeared from files, how witnesses had been intimidated into silence. With each revelation, the judge's expression darkened. A parade of witnesses followed, former victims of Brooks' abuse who'd finally found the courage to speak up. Their stories painted a picture of an officer who terrorized the community while his superiors looked the other way. Some broke down in tears as they described how the incidents had affected their lives, their trust in law enforcement shattered. The forensic accountant's testimony revealed suspicious patterns in Brooks' finances. Regular cash deposits just under reporting limits, unexplained assets, connections to businesses that had paid him for security consulting while he was on duty. The implications of corruption were clear. During a brief recess, the FBI agent watched as his daughter spoke with other victims in the hallway. They thanked her for being brave enough to stand up, for having a father who could help expose the truth. She listened to their stories with compassion, understanding now that her experience was part of a much larger pattern of injustice. The police chief was called to testify next. Under intense questioning, he struggled to explain why Brooks had been allowed to continue patrolling despite numerous red flags. His attempts to defend departmental procedures fell apart as the prosecutors presented email after email showing he'd been warned about Brooks' behavior. "Did you read this complaint filed 6 months ago?" the prosecutor asked, holding up a document. A young mother reported Officer Brooks handcuffed her in front of her children over a broken taillight. She provided video evidence. Your response? The chief's uncomfortable silence spoke volumes. Brooks' fellow officers began to turn against him. Several came forward to testify about incidents they'd witnessed but had been afraid to report. One young officer described being told to learn from Brooks during his training period, despite being uncomfortable with his methods. The social media evidence proved particularly damaging. Brooks' private posts revealed deep-seated prejudices and connections to extremist groups. His attorney's attempts to explain them away as dark humor fell flat as prosecutors showed how his online comments correlated with his targeting of specific communities. The civil rights attorney presented statistics showing the racial disparity in Brooks' traffic stops and arrests. The numbers were so skewed they couldn't be explained by chance. Maps of his patrol patterns revealed deliberate targeting of certain neighborhoods and demographic groups. As the hearing stretched into its second day, it became clear this case would have far-reaching consequences. The judge ordered a full federal investigation into the department's practices. The police chief was suspended pending further review. Several senior officers were placed on administrative leave. Local news coverage was constant, with reporters diving deep into the department's history of handling complaints. Community activists organized peaceful demonstrations supporting the investigation. Other departments across the state began reviewing their own oversight procedures, worried about similar issues in their ranks. Brooks' union representatives, seeing the weight of evidence against him, began distancing themselves from his defense. His previous departments were now under scrutiny for their roles in concealing his behavior. The thin blue line that had protected him for so long was finally breaking. The FBI agent's daughter sat through it all, watching justice unfold. Her ordeal had opened the door for others to seek justice, had exposed systemic problems that needed fixing. As she listened to testimony after testimony, she realized that sometimes the biggest changes start with one person refusing to be silenced. The hearing concluded with the judge's decision to move forward with federal civil rights charges against Brooks and a broader investigation into departmental practices. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about transforming a system that had failed its community for far too long. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, the community gathered in the Cedar Grove Community Center for a town hall meeting. The room was packed with residents, journalists, and law enforcement officials from across the state. The changes that had swept through their police department had become a model for reform nationwide. The FBI agent's daughter stood at the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. No longer just a victim of injustice, she had become a powerful advocate for police accountability. "What happened to me that night was wrong," she began, but the response from this community made all the difference. The evidence gathered during the investigation had led to sweeping changes. Officer Brooks had been convicted on multiple civil rights violations and was serving time in federal prison. His certification as a law enforcement officer had been permanently revoked. The investigation into his finances had revealed a network of corruption that led to additional charges. But the story didn't end with one officer's conviction. The police chief and several senior officers had been forced to resign. The department's internal affairs division had been completely restructured, with oversight now provided by a civilian review board. Mrs. Chen, the shop owner who'd first recorded the incident, was now a member of that board. The new police chief, a reformer brought in from another state, had implemented mandatory body cameras and strict accountability measures. Every traffic stop was now reviewed. Officers underwent extensive bias training, and their social media activity was regularly monitored for signs of prejudice. Mr. Patel's pharmacy had become an unofficial community center. The wall where he posted notices about the investigation was now covered with thank you notes from residents who'd finally felt safe enough to share their own stories. His security cameras had been upgraded, and other business owners had followed suit, creating a network of civilian oversight. The young officer who'd testified about being told to learn from Brooks during training was now in charge of the department's new mentorship program. He worked to ensure rookie officers learned the right way to serve and protect their community. "We're here to help people," he often said, "not to intimidate them." The civil rights attorney who'd helped build the case had opened a local office. She worked with the community to ensure the reforms stayed in place, offering free legal clinics to help people understand their rights. The FBI agent's daughter often volunteered there, sharing her story with others who needed encouragement to speak up. The department's new hiring practices had become a national standard. Background checks now included thorough social media reviews. Psychological evaluations were more rigorous. Officers who transferred between departments had their entire service records scrutinized, with no more quiet resignations to avoid discipline. Local schools had implemented new programs teaching students about their rights and responsibilities during police encounters. The FBI agent occasionally spoke to classes, sharing what he'd learned about the importance of standing up for justice, even when it seemed intimidating. The changes weren't just on paper. Crime rates had actually decreased as community trust in law enforcement grew. People were more willing to cooperate with officers they saw as partners rather than threats. The us versus them mentality that had poisoned police-community relations was slowly being replaced by mutual respect. Technology played a crucial role in the new accountability. The dashcam videos that had exposed Brooks' behavior led to a state law requiring all police vehicles to have tamper-proof recording systems. The department's computer system now automatically flagged unusual patterns in officers' arrest records for review. The courthouse where the case had been heard now hosted monthly community forums where residents could voice concerns directly to law enforcement leaders. The judge who'd presided over Brooks' case made sure these meetings weren't just for show. She required regular progress reports on implementing community suggestions. Mrs. Chen's video of the arrest had sparked a movement. Citizens across the state had organized copwatch groups, using their phones to document police interactions. But unlike before, many officers now welcomed the recordings, seeing them as protection against false accusations and proof of their professional conduct. The FBI agent's daughter had turned her experience into a force for positive change. She spoke at police academies about the importance of ethical conduct. Her story wasn't just about one bad officer anymore, it was about how communities could work together to prevent abuse of power. As the town hall meeting concluded, residents shared their own stories of change. A young driver talked about a recent traffic stop where the officer had been professional and respectful. An elderly resident described feeling safe walking at night again. A teenager mentioned applying to the police academy, wanting to be part of the new generation of officers. The FBI agent watched proudly as his daughter answered questions from the audience. Her ordeal had sparked a transformation that went beyond their small community. Departments across the country were studying the Cedar Grove model of police reform. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest changes start with one person brave enough to stand up for what's right. The story of that night, of a racist officer who thought he was above the law, had become a story of hope, of a community coming together to demand better. It showed that justice, while sometimes slow, could prevail when people refused to be silent in the face of wrongdoing. As the meeting ended and people lingered to talk, there was a sense of achievement in the air. The fear that had once divided the community had been replaced by determination to maintain the progress they'd made. What had started as one father's fight for justice had become a blueprint for lasting change.